Coming up on this WEBN special report, we sit down with the state senator fighting fake news on Beacon Hill. And we take a look at how technology fuels the spread of misinformation. And we give you the tools to spot the difference between fact and fiction while surfing the web. Hello, I'm Rob Way, and welcome to this WEBN special report. Walter Cronkite once said that journalism is what we as a nation need to make democracy work. But the media landscape has changed dramatically since the most trusted man in news retired in 1981. Corporate consolidation, cable news, and of course the internet have forever changed the way we get our news. But in the last few years, journalists have been introduced to a new challenge: fake news. But what is it? The term fake news applies to anything that appears to be news, is spread over mass media, and is usually created to influence political views. Chances are you've heard a lot about it recently. Fake news seems to be everywhere. It's on your Twitter feed, your morning newspaper, and on your television. It's a complicated issue to say the least, and one lawmaker in Massachusetts is trying to tackle it one student at a time.
I think what we've seen is a breakdown in both trust in institutions and in a belief in actually kind of neutral arbitrator, or neutral mediator, balls and strikes, calling them as they see them, fact-based reporting rather than opinion-based reporting.
That was State Senator Eric Lesser. Last month, he introduced a bill he says will fight fake news through education in Massachusetts schools. For more on our exclusive interview with the senator, I'm joined in studio by our State House correspondent, Jill Gearin. Jill?
Thank you, Rob. Senator Lesser's bill is called an act relative to civics and new media literacy education in schools. In short, the bill aims to widen basic civics education to include lessons on how to spot fake information. When students in Massachusetts learn about voting, they will also learn about where to find reliable information on the people they're voting for. Lesser says one of the challenges the bill is trying to overcome is separating politics from fact.
But I think the key is distinguishing between opinion journalism and fact journalism. So there's an old saying, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. So I think what distinguishes so-called fake news from actual news is fake news is news that's not double-checked, that's not corroborated by independent sourcing, and is not based in fact. It's based in opinion and based in advocacy rather than based in objective truths.
The bill is part of a larger goal to revamp the state's approach to civics education. Lesser says these updates are long overdue in today's rapidly changing media landscape.
My bill would require training in media literacy around things like social media, around things like online content, how you double check a source, how you understand how reporting works, how you understand how to differentiate between fact and opinion. Those are important skills that our schools have traditionally taught, but it was really geared towards an older, frankly more quaint time when information was more established through intermediaries like publishers and encyclopedias. In the kind of Wild West we have of the internet and social media age, we really need to equip young people and equip students to understand how to differentiate between different types of sources.
If Senator Lesser's bill is passed, it could pose a daunting challenge for teachers who are often further behind on technology and media skills than the students in their classrooms. He says a key provision in the bill makes sure every educator is given the tools he or she needs to teach in the digital age.
I think teachers are hungry to do this. A lot of teachers are already doing this in their English classes or in their social studies classes, or even just in conversation with their students in a math class about what's happening in the world or how to consume content. I think we do need to train teachers. I think we need to make sure teachers are adequately supported, that our school districts are supported with the resources to take this on. Look, education is not static. It has to reflect changes in society, changes in technology.
We will be hearing more from Senator Lesser later on, but now let's go back to Rob for more on what others in Massachusetts are doing to fight fake news. Rob?
Thank you, Jill. The fight against fake news goes beyond Beacon Hill in Massachusetts. Media Literacy Now is an organization working to improve the way Americans use media. Right now, Ross Ketchke is in studio with a special guest from Media Literacy Now.
Thank you, Rob. I'm joined in studio by Tamara Sobel. She is the Director of Legislation, Policy, and Community Organizing at Media Literacy Now here in Massachusetts, and we're very excited to have her here today. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, great to be here.
So before we start, can you just tell me what your organization, Media Literacy Now, does both nationwide and specifically here in Massachusetts?
Sure. Media Literacy Now is a national organization. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to promote media literacy education in schools. And in Massachusetts, I'm the representative for policy and legislation here in Massachusetts. So we do a lot to promote media literacy education. We work with the legislature promoting and advocating for media literacy education policies.
Mm-hmm. So what is media literacy? When you say that and you're working with politicians, what does that exactly mean?
Sure. Media literacy is the literacy you need to understand the information in the media that's all around you. It's critical thinking skills that allow you to evaluate media messages, the power of media, the purpose of media. Those are all media literacy skills.
So your organization and in your work in it, you have to have a great understanding of media, how it affects people's lives, and the big issue that we're exploring is fake news.
Right.
So how would you define fake news?
Well, that's a little tricky. It tends to be very politically charged right now, and since we're a nonpartisan organization. Media literacy is really broader than fake news. It's a bigger picture set of skills to allow people to see, not just tell what's true information and false information, which of course is very important, but also to see bias and perspective in news and information that's all around you. So fake news is really part of what everyone's talking about, but media literacy is much broader than that.
And how do you think that media literacy education could be a path towards helping people understand the problem of fake news and ultimately solve it?
Well, I think the most important thing to know is that we live in an information age, and literacy, being literate today, is being media literate. So you need to understand all the information around you in the news, on websites and social media, and media literacy gives you the skills for critical thinking about all media around you.
And so why is it important for people to be able to understand what they're looking at is true, or if it's misleading or outright fake? Why is that important?
Well, in a democracy, we need to use information, we depend on information, and in an effective democracy, you need to be informed. And to be informed, you need to be able to be literate about the news and information you see, and media literacy gives those critical thinking skills.
Mm-hmm. So with education, and including media literacy in education, how exactly would it fit into a classroom, say, here in Massachusetts?
Well, there are many ways. We believe that media literacy can be incorporated into pretty much every subject in school, and it should be, because you depend on news and media information in so much of your studies in school.
In the digital age, today, we were speaking before the interview started, sometimes you'll see children, very young children, walking around with smartphones or with tablets. It can get to the point where sometimes the children in the classroom are more adept with technology than the teachers that are actually in front of the class. So how would you say teachers should be prepared to make their students more media literate?
It's interesting that you said that. There are studies that show, particularly there was a Stanford University study in 2016 that shows that even though kids are more savvy than older adults about using technology and multitasking and knowing which apps are cool and all that, they actually have very poor skills in discerning what's real information, what's the difference between advertising content and news content. Mm-hmm. In the Stanford study, I believe that 80% of middle schoolers couldn't tell the difference between advertising content and news content.
And what are some of those critical skills? How would you suggest that someone, whether they're reading something on a social media feed or wherever it may pop up in technology in front of them, mm-hmm. what is a critical skill of being able to look at something and know this is fake, or this is misleading, or this is trying to get me to think something that may not be true?
Sure. Well, there are many techniques in the curriculum that are available to teachers and to students. Just for example, using, I think journalists know the term triangulation. Mm-hmm. So being able to verify a news story or a piece of information from different sources, not just relying on one source. You know, there's all this talk about echo chambers. People are stuck in their own way of thinking because they only look at one type of media.
A little earlier you mentioned how information has somewhat become political. Now I know you're in a non-partisan, non-political organization, but how do you think media has gotten to a point where it's become so political and so ingrained into the political discourse of today?
Well, I think social media has a lot to do with everything. You know, we talked about media has been around a long time, the internet has been around a long time, But social media is relatively new. So I think, I would say 2007, 2008, 2009, it became much more mainstream. And so people have used it to spread information, and social media tends to be sort of segmented into networks of people who think the same thing. So that's sort of the echo chamber part. But yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the explosion of social media.
Great. Well, I really want to thank you for taking the time to sit down with us today. It's been great having you in the studio. We're going to go back to Rob now with more on the WEBN special on fake news. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. For many of us, fake news and misinformation can seem like a theoretical problem. It's not easy to point to a specific victim or blame any one person. But even though the news is fake, the targets are real-world people, and the results can have real-world consequences. WEBN's Javier Rodriguez went to the scene of one of the most chaotic breaking news stories in years, the mass shooting at Stoneham Douglas High School in Florida. He tells us how fake news, frantic media, and a polarized press affected the victims in Parkland.
I want to see AR-15s and weapons of war out of people's hands because it's just something we don't need.
I just don't think that fighting fire with fire is going to make anything better. So I think more protection and less guns would be the better option.
These students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School are being framed as paid crisis actors. This conspiracy theory targets students who have been calling for stronger gun control measures.
I believe they should just ban AR-15s because that's like a military weapon.
These claims are trending on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. This Facebook post got over 111,000 shares. It led people to believe that the Parkland students were performers. The post has since been taken down, as well as many others just like this one. U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos talked about fake news in a press conference in Parkland, but not about this conspiracy. She says the media has been twisting the way the new bill works, the bill that'll allow some teachers to carry weapons in schools. DeVos says the media has been leading people to believe that any teacher will be allowed to be armed.
Well, let's be clear. I think it's to say arming teachers is a oversimplification and a mischaracterization, really. I think the concept is for those schools and those communities that opt to do this, as they have in Texas and as they have in Polk County and other places around the country, to have people who are expert in being able to defend and having lots and lots of training in order to do so.
The spread of misinformation online comes as Silicon Valley faces pressure to combat fake news. For WEBN, I'm Javier Rodriguez.
Thank you, Javier. I'm now joined live in studio by WEBN's Sean Stackhouse with more on how social media enables the spread of fake news and how it could affect you depending on your politics.
Thanks, Rob. According to intelligence experts, fake news has been used as a weapon against American voters. Throughout the 2016 presidential election, viral stories spread over the internet, making wild claims about candidates, voter information, and other key facets to the election process. A federal investigation was launched to discover the extent to which foreign nations use fake news to influence American voters. That investigation indicted 4 members of then-candidate Donald Trump's campaign and 13 Russian nationals. According to those indictments, the majority of alleged misleading stories tried to dissuade voters from supporting Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton. Many of the posts targeted minority groups, including blacks and Muslims, who traditionally swing Democrat nationwide. To better understand the problem, let's look at those it actually affects, the American people. A lot of research is still being done into what fake news is, but there's undoubtedly a divide on the issue. A new Gallup poll shows that a rift runs firmly along party lines. They asked 19,000 people who was at fault for the fake news. 40% of Republicans said the news media, and its bias towards conservatives was most to blame. On the other side of the aisle, only 26% of Democrats polled thought the so-called mainstream media contributed to the problem. But no matter their political affiliation, 3/4 of Americans say the spread of misinformation is a threat to democracy. Journalism has been a cornerstone of American democracy since before the revolution. We now go live to WEBN's Chloe Thibault, who spoke with an expert about the changing relationship between Americans and the news media. Chloe?
I'm standing on Melk Street in an area called Newspaper Row. Now, a lot has changed since it was home to dozens of small papers in the 19th and 20th centuries. I sat down with Boston University's Michelle Amazine to find out how we are all struggling to keep up with today's changing media landscape.
You had to own a press in order to have the ability to print the news or broadcast the news.
Professor Michelle Amazine has spent her career studying the way people use media. She says the internet and other new technology have opened the door to a world of virtually limitless knowledge. Americans spend an average of 8 hours a day looking at screens. And with this rise in social media and new forms of internet marketing, audiences haven't figured out how to handle this information overload.
Very few people are able to recognize the difference between native advertising and journalistic content.
Native advertising is when a company disguises an ad for their product as a piece of news, complete with a headline, byline, and the look and feel of an online article. While the Federal Trade Commission requires native advertisements to disclose that they are not real news, there is no firm rule to hold companies accountable.
You can make up any word and say you've disclosed that it's an advertisement. Most people don't understand what those disclosures mean.
Amazine says it's usually not too hard to notice if what you're reading is a native advertisement or fake news. The key to telling the difference almost always comes down to the source.
First of all, notice the source. I'm surprised in my research and in research elsewhere how few people notice even where information comes from. People just don't take the time to notice.
Amazine says it's getting harder every day to tell the difference between fake and fact. That's why it's important to think before you click. Live in Boston, I'm Chloe Thibault, WEBN News.
Thank you, Chloe. WEBN's Catherine Lazowitz is here with me. She researched Professor Amazine's studies. Catherine is going to show us how to spot clues online to know if what you're reading is news, an ad, or just downright fake. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rob. So you and I today are going to be looking at screenshots of 3 different stories. One is a native advertisement, another is a viral fake news story, and the third is a legitimate report. Together we're going to figure out which is which, and I'll show you the keys to spotting the difference. So let's take a look at this first one here. So Rob, what is the first thing you notice right off the bat with this particular screenshot?
Well, I see at the top we are on the Washington Post website, or so it looks. And I mean, we have the headline, we see the reporters' names, and it just looks like an everyday news story to me.
Right, exactly. So what you've noticed are the key things right off the bat, which is that it is the Washington Post's actual website. But a good way to check is to look at the byline. So you see there are 2 reporters whose names you can look up and confirm are actually employed by the Washington Post. And the other thing I would just draw to your attention is the multimedia embedded here in the story. So there are 2 things you should notice. One is that it is a video that you could confirm the actual report going on. And then the second is if you look way down there at the bottom, you can see that the video was actually shot by Reuters, which is just another great news source and another way to confirm that this is a true report.
Great.
All right, so let's move on to the second one. So again, Rob, what is the first thing that grabs your attention here?
All right, I can see we're at the New York Times, and then I can see we have our news article here. We have Netflix. So is this just an ad here, or is this the whole story?
All right, so see, Rob has pointed out the exact issue here. So yes, it is the New York Times' website, but if you look between the New York Times and the Netflix, you see something called a paid post. And that's a wonderful clue to show you that this is actually what is called a native advertisement. So what that means is that Netflix has paid for the New York Times to post their advertisement within the New York Times' website. So it's meant to draw your attention and you want to read it as if it were a news article. See here, there's even a byline, but it is not actually a news article. It is simply an advertisement.
So how could I tell the difference between having this paid post here and just a banner ad you would see if you were logged onto the New York Times website?
It's another good question. Mostly it's the layout. The fact that it's almost like a full page here should be an indication. And another thing is an advertisement, a normal advertisement, would not have a byline and would not have a title. These are all things meant to draw your eye, to treat it as if it were a feature.
Gotcha.
All right, so the third one is clearly different. So Rob, using the skills we've just learned here today, what is it that you see that tips you off that maybe this is a little strange?
Well, I've never heard of this website before, yournewswire.com. News, Truth, Unfiltered. So, I mean, that's an interesting byline there. And then we have this article here, London closes 500 churches, opens 423 new mosques. I've never heard of this reporter or this before, so that sort of throws me off a little.
Good, and those instincts are right, and you should be alarmed because you pointed out just about everything correctly, which is, one, this is not a certified news source. It is meant to try and mimic a URL for something like CNN News or Fox News or what have you. And also, even look, these sections are meant to also capture what, say, the Washington Post's website looks like with the different headers. But as you rightfully pointed out, this byline is a little different, and as is the actual title of the news article. So the two things I would draw to attention here is this one first. It's not by this gentleman, Baxter Dimitri. It looks almost like a username. So that should be a first tip-off that this is not a reputable news source. And of course, you could always look up the gentleman and see if he actually is a writer. That's another thing you could chase down. But then the other thing is the actual news article itself. Does it strike you as a little odd, perhaps, a little bombastic?
Yes, it does.
And that sort of exaggeration is something that you should watch out for with these fake news stories.
Great.
All right, so just so you know, moving forward, in 2016, NPR did put out a list of tips among these to help its listeners spot fake news stories online. And here's a look at what they said. First, pay attention to the URLs, and let's go back to that fake news story we just saw. That story came from a site called yournewswire.com, and at first it sounds like it could be a real news source, but have you actually ever heard of it? Chances are you haven't, which should raise a red flag. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't trust the source just because you haven't seen it before, but the key here is to dig a little deeper. And next, read the About Us section. If information there seems like it's being too dramatic or overblown, you should read with caution. Next, look at the quotes and who said them. If there aren't experts or witnesses in the story, it's very tough to verify where that information is coming from. And finally, read the headline and the first few sentences carefully. A lot of fake news is shared over social media, so catchy and exaggerated headlines have become the norm. So let's go back to that fake news story one more time. Maybe the headline catches your eye, but the real giveaway is the first few sentences where there are phrases like creeping Islamization of London or Sharia courts. And all of these are designed to spark an emotional reaction in the reader and inspire Islamophobia. All of these are signs that this story is fake news. And if you can't figure out if something you're reading is real or fake, websites like PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, and Snopes give you more tools to find the truth.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for joining us. Those are certainly some helpful tips. The rights to a free press and free speech are two of the foundations of America. For democracy to succeed, those voting need to know who and what they're voting for. In the now famous Supreme Court case, New York Times versus the United States, Justice Black wrote, "The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. The government's power to censor the press was abolished, so the press would remain forever free to censure the government. The press keeps power in check." Senator Eric Lesser says a confrontational press is crucial for preserving democracy.
Because at the end of the day, this whole system is really based on trust. And if you demonize the participants, if you demonize the institution, rather than having honest disagreements about the ideas or the policies, you go in a very dangerous place. And that's not a Republican or Democrat issue. That's not a left or right issue. You see leaders in other countries coming from the left who are demonizing the press. You see a lot of leaders that come from the right and demonize the press. It's unfortunately more a symptom of a style of governance that I think we need to be vigilant against.
Institutions have come under attack in recent years. President Donald Trump has taken on the term fake news to describe media outlets who are often critical of him. In his very first press conference after being inaugurated, President Trump refused to take a CNN reporter's question, pointing at them and saying, "You are fake news." The cable news network had recently published an anonymously sourced account of Mr. Trump's trip to Moscow for one of his Miss Universe pageants. At the end of President Trump's first year in office, he published the so-called Fake News Awards, criticizing a list of journalists and outlets on the GOP website for the work they have done covering his first year in office. Other jabs often made via Twitter, including insults like the failing New York Times. At his rallies, President Trump has often made reporters the target of jeers from crowds of supporters. WCVB News Managing Editor Jerry Wardwell says covering this administration has presented unique challenges, even at a local level.
Because people start calling us fake news, but they'll call us fake news even if we do that and even if we don't. It's funny. Sometimes I get the feeling that if the side of the story that somebody doesn't like, you become fake news.
President Trump is not alone in distrusting members of the mainstream media. We go live to WEBN's Christina Gesford, who spoke with the everyday citizens who say the media has let them down.
When you hear the term fake news, you may think of wild stories shared on your social media feeds. But for many Americans, the nation's largest papers and broadcast networks are the real fake news.
If one were to get scientific about it, fake news would be news that is quite literally fake, that is in its entirety untrue.
Where there is a strong bias in the media as opposed to reporting the facts of an incident.
A story without sources.
I would characterize The Onion as fake news.
CNN, NBC a little bit, HuffPost a little bit, definitely Fox News at times. There's no doubt that there's the other bias there as well.
There's a lot of outlets I really don't like. I don't think they have a lot of integrity, but I wouldn't call them fake news.
It's partly based on ratings and what gets people's attention. In the social media, digital age that we live in, it's a lot easier to create echo chambers, and when you create echo chambers, you create a constant viewership and loyalty to certain views that you want to read.
Fox News is targeting the Trump voter, the working class voter, the conservative, the Republicans, the independents who could lean a little bit to the right, while CNN and MSNBC are pandering to the liberal, the Democrat, the Democratic Socialist, the liberal parties.
The crafty viewer should be able to go, oh, well, yeah, Bill O'Reilly's not a news program. Sean Hannity is not a news program. Anderson Cooper is not a news program. 360, it's a commentary program. It's where he takes a newsworthy item and then talks about what he thinks it means, or what it should mean, or what it might mean. That's not news.
If they believe what the host is saying, then they consider it news.
It's important to teach them that difference, because if you don't, they're just going to keep giving money to whatever makes them happy, which is going to be news that agrees with them, which is going to be actually commentary, not news.
There are plenty of hardworking YouTubers or bloggers or something like that are out there just trying to report the facts on all sides, and some are more biased than others. But it's at least a start that it kind of gives a pushback to the mainstream voices that we always hear the same things from.
I mean, you can't just pander to your audience, and I want to know on Fox News whether the president's doing a bad thing as well, because I think everybody knows when their leader is not doing well. On MSNBC, I'd like to see when the president does well, like for example these plants and these tax cuts, I'd like to see a little more positive analyzation, like the good, and both the good and the bad.
Fake news should be something that we're all concerned about, but it shouldn't be something that's used as a political tool to either take down honest media or attack independent media. It should just be something everybody is cognizant of and everybody's aware of, and that when looking at a piece of media, especially relating to news, you put your biases aside and look at the facts first.
Whether they disagreed with the politics or the practices in the newsroom, everyone I spoke with agreed the media should be more committed to the truth. Live outside Newspaper Row, I'm Christina Gesford for WEBN News.
WEBN's Jessica Shorter-Bonney met with news leaders in Boston to learn what they're doing to fight fake news and keep the trust of their audiences.
If one of the sides is something that someone disagrees with, it automatically becomes fake news, and it's not fake news. It's just us doing our jobs.
And doing his job has become much harder. Jerry Wardwell is the assistant news director at WCVB. While the rise of fake news hasn't changed the way he does his job, it has affected how his viewers consume it.
I often look at fake news as being something that's being described of us putting out, where I think what we put out is the real information. I don't think from the mainstream media that there's a swell of fake news, because I think the mainstream media follows the criteria that you would for any story.
And that criteria isn't easy to agree on. President Trump's administration has accused multiple news outlets of putting out alleged false information, despite the information being factually correct. But Wardwell says he isn't here to make politicians happy.
Our role isn't to be rah-rah with the president, which I think some of this fake news conversation has turned into, that if it's the press trying to hold the president accountable or any elected official accountable if we report on something they don't like, it's forget about it, it's fake news.
Glenn Marshall is a reporter at NBC 10 Boston, and he's had his fair share of run-ins with people saying he covers fake news. Most recently with protesters at Boston's March for Our Lives rally.
The counter-protesters actually accuse us of being fake news. Some of them wouldn't even talk to us for the simple fact that they're like NBC, nothing but crap.
Despite the bad press the media is getting, Marshall says he and his fellow reporters won't compromise as journalists.
It comes with the job. We focus our attention on what we're called to do and what our passions are and make sure that we do it right, no matter what people may say, whoever it is, if it's elected officials or just someone walking down the street claiming that we're fake news. If we bring the facts, you can't change that.
Reporting from Boston, I'm Jessica Short-Horbani.
Thank you, Jessica. Fake news will not be an easy problem to tackle as a nation, but as Patrick Moynihan once famously said on the Senate floor, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. So let's stick to the facts. For WEBN News, I'm Rob Way. Thank you.